Have you ever been a victim of injustice? Have you ever found yourself in a situation where maybe because of how you look or your gender or your accent, you are treated differently than other people? Have you ever been in a situation where simply for being who you are, you find yourself excluded or marginalized or even criminalized? Certainly we're living in a time right now where in our country and in places around the world, people are increasingly aware and increasingly frustrated with the injustices in society. And there are people who are becoming not simply just frustrated or turned off, but who are even becoming angry, and the anger is spilling out onto the streets, and people are protesting, and people are doing everything they can to say, stop this injustice. I mean, after all, if you have been treated poorly, it's very natural for you to react. The story we're going to read today, though, shows an amazing situation that happens in the life of Jesus, the ultimate experience of injustice, and yet in the midst of this injustice, something amazing, something you might even say foolish, as in unexpected, comes out. It says this: at noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. And at 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, I should probably just give you a hint here. This is the part of the story in Mark's gospel where Jesus is on the cross. He's being crucified. And the reason he's been crucified is not because he's a criminal, not because he's done anything wrong, because of just being who he is and claiming to be who he is. The religious leaders and the political leaders of his day have decided that it would be easier to silence him permanently because they were unable to win the argument, the debate with him. And so they have somehow concocted a story, and they have gotten the Roman authorities to go along with it. And now Jesus is on the cross and he's dying. He is an innocent man and he's experiencing the ultimate injustice. And in the midst of his injustice, he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Even Jesus, in his moment of injustice, felt forsaken by God. It's a very common feeling when things are going bad to feel like maybe God is not there at all. Maybe he has abandoned us. Certainly, if God was with us, why would he allow us to go through what we're experiencing? But the story continues. When some of those standing near heard this, they say, listen, he's calling Elijah. Someone ran with a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. Even in his time of distress, the people around him are still mocking him. They bring him vinegar on a sponge rather than water in an attempt to make him thirstier than he already is. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, surely this man was the Son of God. Now, you might not remember, but a few episodes ago, we discussed that Jesus had a conversation in Mark chapter 8 with his disciples, and he asked them, hey, who do people say that I am? And they gave him all kinds of answers, from a good man to a prophet to some kind of a leader. But he asked them, who did they, his disciples, say he was? And Peter said, we think you're the Christ, the Messiah. But this is the first time in the Gospel of Mark that anyone has recognized Jesus as who he really is, the Son of God. And amazingly, it was a Gentile, a Roman centurion, who recognized it. And he recognized it not when Jesus was doing some amazing miracle, not when he was healing or feeding of thousands or even resurrecting someone from the dead, but he recognized it in his moment of ultimate agony and injustice. He recognized that he was the Son of God in the moment that he died. What's very interesting is that Mark specifically uses the phrase of the centurion. It says, and when he saw how he died, he exclaimed, surely this must be the Son of God. Now, perhaps this doesn't really make any sense to you, and this kind of sounds foolish, but let me see if I can explain. The centurion was somebody whose profession it was to kill people. He was a professional killer, and one of his jobs was to administer the punishment of crucifixion to those whom the Roman state deemed to be the worst of the worst. Crucifixion really was not a form of execution as such. It was really a form of torture. It was this evil, ingenious method that was discovered by the Phoenicians, perfected by the Romans, and it allowed you to keep someone alive as long as possible, teetering on the brink between life and death without actually killing them. And how crucifixion worked basically was like this. The person would be attached or affixed to the cross with ropes and nails, and their hands would be raised, stretched out above their shoulders. They would also be forced to stand on a ledge. Their knees would be bent and so their knees would kind of be raised up towards their abdomen. And what this did is that it produced the effect of compressing or collapsing the person's lungs and their diaphragm, which meant that they were not able to breathe normally. They were not able to take a deep breath. And so in order to breathe, they had to sort of pull themselves up on the ropes and on the nails that were through their wrists, and excruciating pain would shoot through them as they did this. And then they could take a full breath. They would try to hold it as long as possible, and then they would collapse back down into that position. And so basically what crucifixion was this race between how long you wanted to breathe versus how much pain you could endure. Once the pain became too much and once the muscle fatigue took over, then the person would basically suffocate in their own juices, as it were. And so when people died on the cross, number one, it took several days, not several hours, 3-4 days, some historians say. But more than that, when a person died from crucifixion, they didn't die saying anything. They didn't die shouting, certainly with a loud voice, because basically they had exhausted all of their oxygen, and so they died in a whimper with a guttural kind of coughing, spluttering sound. And so this centurion had seen people die on a cross hundreds, maybe even thousands of times, and he had never witnessed someone who had the strength to pull themselves up, inhale a deep gust of air, and shout something out with a loud voice. He'd never seen someone with that much strength in the next instant breathe their last. And so this centurion realized that this man who had just died had not died in a normal or natural way. He had died in a way that, according at least to the centurion from his perspective, meant that the only kind of person who could do this is somebody who has access to some power that most people don't have. And so seeing how Jesus died, the centurion became convinced that this must be the Son of God. I want to give you just a very small experiment. Right now where you are, I want you to attempt to breathe your lust. I'll give you 3 seconds. You can't do it, can you? How do you just breathe out and stop breathing? But this is what Jesus did. And so here's the strange thing. In this moment of his worst injustice, in this moment of his worst agony and pain, God is still made visible through Jesus's life. And so here's my challenge. Could it be, as terrible as injustice is, and as much as we should fight against it, and certainly in our own lives, we should chase it out of our experience, could it be that sometimes it's in those moments of injustice that God can most clearly be seen? It's in the way that people react and respond that even the people who are part of the oppressing force have to stop and say, wait a minute, there is something happening here that is not usual. There is something here that seems and sort of reflects who God is in this moment. And so the very first person in the Gospel of Mark, who most scholars believe is the first gospel ever written, the very first person to recognize that Jesus was the Son of God was a Gentile centurion who was trying to kill him. And if that doesn't seem foolish, then I don't know what is. I hope that you come to be those who in difficulty, trial, and injustice discover the presence of God. That when you feel perhaps most abandoned, you realize that maybe it is then that God is with you the closest. And may you come to follow God's own fool. And like the centurion, be able to tell, believe the unbelievable, and come be a fool as well.